back to our slide deck. Now, as far as the service properties, okay, we have a lot of different choices for accounts. So let me go ahead and discuss those. You have basically built-in accounts, and then it says do not use these on production service. Okay, it is not a best practice to do that, but let's just look at these anyway. The first one is local system. This account does not require a password. The local system account is highly privileged account, so do not use it. The next one is local service. This account does not require a password also. However, using the local service account may prevent the service from interacting with other service. And then finally you have the network service. This does have access to the network, so there's a slight advantage here, but nevertheless we recommend that you do not use this account for SQL Server or even the SQL Server agent. So this brings up to the second point, which is what is preferred. This is where you want to use local user or a domain user account. These are more appropriate for running SQL Server services. Okay, ideally you want to have a dedicated account for each service. So in my experience, it is not uncommon to have a specific account created for a specific service, and this way you can configure it to have I guess the minimum necessary privileges that account needs to run the particular SQL Server service. Okay, and also not a good idea to have a personal account or a, like, let's say a user account running SQL service. And so why is that bad? Because imagine you set up a SQL Server and you put it under your account, and then if you leave the company and they may disable your account, well then that SQL Server will be SOL, and it will not be able to restart or work properly, I guess. Okay, so that's what I wanted to mention about account. If you were to go back, let me show you. I'm not going to change it, but if you were to go to properties, and let's pretend this was a domain, you would select this, you would browse to your domain. So instead of where it says laptop PC, you'll say domain, and then you check the particular account that you want to run the service in. After that is done, you basically apply it, and then you hit OK. And the changes will not be applied until you restart the service. Moving on to the SQL Server network protocols, we have a number of choices here. The first one is shared memory. This is the simplest protocol to use and has no configurable settings. This can only connect to a SQL Server instance running on the same computer. So again, this is not really useful for most database activity. You may have a situation where we create a SQL Server and then you just want to test things locally. That is fine, but this will not work in a real lifetime environment. Moving on, we are looking at TCP/IP. This is I would say the most common protocol, which is widely used over the internet, and this is used primarily, I would say, in most of the environments. Okay, not only for personal but also for business use. This lets you configure your computer to use, like I mentioned, TCP/IP, but most network computers are already correctly configured. This is better. This is also better if you have a situation of a slow LAN, which I believe nowadays it's not an issue, but keep that in mind. Moving on, the next choice is named pipes. This is a protocol developed for local area networks. Another option, to using TCP/IP. And then you have VIA, which is a virtual interface adapter, which works with the VIA hardware. Okay, these are the network protocols. Now, as far as ports and pipes, TCP/IP by default, the instance of database engine listens on port 1433. Okay, so for best practice, it is better to change this in a production environment. The reason for this is that the hackers obviously are aware of this port, and if they do get access or they try to get access to your machine, they will definitely try to ping you on this port, and that basically leads you to this recommendation that you can use a different port. At places I have used 1500 or 1501, but you can really pick a port that's available to you. You can also have the ability to listen on multiple ports, on the same IP address, okay? And what you do is you list the ports separated by comma. So like I just mentioned, you could go 1433 comma 1500 comma 1501. This field is limited to 2047 characters, but obviously you can put in different ports. Now if you were using named pipes, you could basically use the default pipe, which is the net library will use to attempt to connect to the target instance of SQL Server, and SQL Server by default listens on this value. Okay, so let's take a look at these ports. As far as like I mentioned, you can first you have to configure this at the server level. So I selected this tab, and then I'm going to go here. Okay, and you can see that in our case we have two protocols that are enabled. Okay, we have shared memory, and by the way, you could right click and this disable it here if you wanted to. And we are also listening, if this was a server, we are also listening on TCP/IP. Now if I want to configure this, like I mentioned, if you want to change the default port, you right click on it, go to properties. Okay, and here are some basic information about that, and then here is where you will change your IP addresses, okay, or configure them. But notice here under TCP port we are listening right now on 1433, and like I mentioned, if this was a production environment, you would definitely want to change this, okay, and use a different one for this. Now in our case, like I said, we have shared memory, we have TCP/IP. Now let's pretend this was a client machine, and if you go here, and maybe in their case, those two, this one and this one that was disabled, or I believe this was let me go back to my, yeah, if TCP/IP or shared memory was disabled at the client level, you will not be able to communicate. Okay, so you want to make sure that A, the protocols are the same, and B, they are listening on the correct IP address and the port. Okay, so again, if I go here, this is again at the client level, right click on it and go to properties, and you can make sure that let's say if you were listening on 1500, that this should also say 1500. Okay, now the last thing I wanted to mention basically is the well, I already kind of walked you through this, but basically that's the client configuration. It is important to make sure that the client configuration matches the values on the server configuration, in addition to the correct protocols being enabled. And one last thing is the alias. This is an alternate name that can be used to make a connection. The alias encapsulates the required elements of a connection string and exposes them with a name chosen by the user. So here's an example. Let's say you do not want to use an IP address. You can set up an alias, and when the client looks for that alias, they shall be able to connect to your SQL Server. So I believe that's all I have. One last thing I wanted to mention is, as far as when you're trying to run services in SQL Server, you could also go to services.msc, which is the it's the Windows default basically services area, and you can definitely come in here. Okay, and you can also get to this from the control panel, but I just showed you a shortcut. If you sort these by name, you should be able to find SQL Server down here. Okay, and you can see that our engine is running and our agent is running too, and it's okay to right click here and stop a service if you want to do that. But like I mentioned earlier, that if you're trying to change the account, it is better to do that in SQL Server Configuration Manager. I believe that concludes our lesson. Thank you for watching the video.